Hello, I am Dr. Aizaz from medicovisual.com, and in today's visual lecture we will talk about a very important topic, the development of pituitary gland. Now in the last lecture we had discussed the development of hypothalamus. We had discussed how the hypothalamus develops as a derivative of diencephalon. So here this structure is hypothalamus. So if I clearly mark it for you, so exactly here, this structure, this is the hypothalamus. This one is hypothalamus. The pituitary gland, it has got another name, pituitary gland. It is also called hypophyseal gland. Hypophyseal gland. Now the term hypo, it has two parts basically, hypo and physeal. The term hypo means under, and physeal or physis, you must have heard this term with reference to the bone, so epiphyseal plate, metaphysis and so on. So physeal basically means growth. So what it means is that this is basically a gland which appears as an undergrowth, and undergrowth under which thing? Under the hypothalamus. So here at the ventral part of hypothalamus, here there is an undergrowth at the ventral part of hypothalamus, and this undergrowth, this scrotum-shaped undergrowth, basically this is basically pituitary gland. Please note it has nothing to do with scrotum. It's just that its shape is like the scrotum, right? So it's a undergrowth below the hypothalamus at the ventral end of hypothalamus. So this is pituitary gland. Now pituitary gland mainly in humans, it has two parts. The anterior pituitary, so pituitary gland, it has mainly two parts. The anterior pituitary, which is of course lying anteriorly, it is the anterior lobe. It is also called anterior lobe of pituitary gland. And we have posterior pituitary. Now anterior pituitary is actually the true gland. It is actually true gland, and this is not a true gland. This is false or pseudo gland. Now what I mean by this, basically the posterior pituitary is direct extension of hypothalamus. We will see in this lecture that here an extension of hypothalamus arises, which is basically posterior pituitary. Now basically what posterior pituitary is doing is that the hormones of posterior pituitary, they are being created within the hypothalamus. They are being created within the hypothalamus, and then from hypothalamus they are stored here in this sac called posterior pituitary. So actually hypothalamus is acting as a gland in sense of the creation of hormones. Hypothalamus is actually creating those hormones, and then those hormones are stored. They are stored in posterior pituitary, as well as when needed they are released by posterior pituitary. But truly a gland is also related with secretion or production. A true gland is also related with production of the hormones. So there is no production of hormones in the posterior pituitary. There is no actual synthesis. Of hormones in the posterior pituitary. That is why it is said that it is not a true gland. It is actually an extension of hypothalamus. But opposite to that, the anterior pituitary is actually the true gland. It actually synthesizes, or it actually produces, as well as it stores, and as well as it has also the function to release the hormones whenever needed. So all three functions are there in the anterior pituitary. So it is actually the true gland. It is actually involved in synthesis of hormone, while the posterior pituitary is actually not involved in synthesis, but it is only involved in storing and release of hormones. right? So this is the basic concept that you must first understand. Now coming to the, and by the way, because it is the posterior pituitary is extension of hypothalamus, it is also called pars is the part, pars nervosa, it's the nervous part. It is the nervous extension. Hypothalamus is the part of nervous system, so it's pars nervosa. Then we have the anterior pituitary, which is also called pars distalis. And also another name that you must know, all these are the name of anterior and posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is called pars distalis and anterior pituitary, and it is also called adenohypophysis. Adeno mean it has something to do with gland, I mean it is actually gland, so it is adenohypophysis. This is another name, adenohypophysis or physis, not physis, hypophysis. Yeah. Adenohypophysis. And this one is the posterior pituitary is not actually true gland, it is extension of nervous system, it is extension of hypothalamus, so it is neurohypophysis, not physis again, neurohypophysis, hypophysis, right? So neurohypophysis, so it is related with nervous system. Neurohypophysis, it is related with, it is actual gland, it is adenohypophysis. Why I'm stressing so much upon this you will understand in a moment. So now as we discuss the development of pituitary gland or hypophyseal gland, now you will basically understand that the posterior part of pituitary gland, because it is neurohypophysis, it is extension of hypothalamus, it means that it will develop as a downward extension or downward outgrowth, downward invagination, downward outgrowth, and so many terms, so many similar terms are used in textbooks, but the basic concept is that it develops as an extension of hypothalamus, right? But before that, please understand that we have also outside it, we have this ectoderm, right? So this is ectodermal covering outside that, and of course we have this first pharyngeal arch. I have removed other part as well. So now before discussing the development of the neurohypophysis or hypophyseal gland in general, here let me tell you what is this yellowish part. This yellowish part here, you can see this yellowish part is actually the oropharyngeal membrane. So if I exactly show you, this membrane is oropharyngeal membrane. Oropharyngeal. It is also, by the way, it is also called buccopharyngeal membrane. And the ectoderm that is surrounding this ectodermal depression, actually, this ectodermal depression that is surrounding it, this ectodermal depression is actually stomodium. Now, some people actually confuse these two terms, stomodium. Some people actually confuse these two terms because in textbooks, the same area is marked as oropharyngeal membrane, and at other places that same area is marked as stomodium. So here let me explain it to you that oropharyngeal is not stomodium. These two are different structures. Let me explain this thing to you by drawing a simple, very simple diagram here. That here, let's suppose from outside, here is the ectoderm. Now ectoderm here, it is slightly depressed like this, and then it is again coming out like this. So whole this is ectoderm, this is ectodermal layer. Please understand this very important concept. Now inside it, deeper to it, there will be endoderm, right? So here is the endoderm like this. This is endodermal tube, GI tube, right? So this is endoderm. So this is endoderm, and outside is ectoderm. Now here, and by the way, in between here there would be mesoderm. So somewhat here there would be mesoderm in the form of mesenchyme typically. Now here you can see at the site of oropharyngeal membrane, here at the site of oropharyngeal membrane, as well as in the cloacal membrane as well, at this site you can see that ectoderm and endoderm, they are stitched together with little to no little to no mesoderm between them. So this is basically bilayered sandwich structure. Bilayered sandwich structure, and the sandwich is basically made up of not of chicken or bread, it is made up of ectoderm and endoderm. So from outside we have ectoderm, from outside we have ectoderm, this bluish one. From inside we have endoderm. In between them there is almost very little or there is no mesoderm, right? Now in this diagram you can see that ectoderm is not flat like this. At the site of oropharyngeal membrane, here you can see at the site of oropharyngeal membrane, ectoderm is depressed like this. It is depressed inward. It is depressed inward like this. So this specific ectodermal depression is called stomodium. This is depression at the site of oropharyngeal membrane. Oropharyngeal membrane is the membrane which consists of ectoderm and endoderm. But at that site, at site of oropharyngeal membrane, there is that ectodermal depression, and that ectodermal depression is called stomodium. And stomodium is actually the primordium of a part of oral cavity, some components of the mouth, the oral cavity, that are basically formed by the stomodium, that we will not discuss in this lecture. But why I am focusing so much about stomodium? The reason is that a component of this pituitary gland, it develops from the stomodium. So if we cut the head of this, if we remove the head like this, we can see the structures inside. Of course, in reality, there would be the developing cerebral cortex here as well, and of course, there would be basal ganglia as well. But I have just removed those structures so you can actually focus on hypothalamus and thalamus and related structures. But here mainly we will focus on hypothalamus. So as I have told you previously that the posterior pituitary, it develops as an extension of hypothalamus because it is neurohypophysis. It is not a true gland, so naturally it develops as an extension of hypothalamus. So we will see that from here, an extension, not from here, from the anterior end, from the ventral end. So from the ventral end of hypothalamus, and extension occurs, extension develops, and invagination develops, and outgrowth develops like this from hypothalamus. Now this outgrowth is actually called posterior pituitary, or it is also called pars nervosa, or it is also called neurohypophysis. Now you can see that here this thickened part, basically there is this thickened part which is part of hypothalamus. It actually contains some nuclei. So this part is actually called infundibulum. Infundibulum. Then below the infundibulum there is this stalk, this stem-like structure, this stalk, not chicken stalk, S-T-A-L-K stalk, right? So this stalk. Then below that we have this actual pars nervosa, the posterior pituitary. These are the structures that you will see here. This is the posterior pituitary. Now we have posterior pituitary, but what about the anterior pituitary? So basically glands, they are typically made up of epithelium, right? They are made up of epithelium. So we need some epithelium to form the actual gland. We need epithelium to form the anterior pituitary gland. So where can we get the epithelium? There are actually three possible ways. We can get the epithelium from mesenchyme to mesenchymal to epithelial transition. Then we can also get epithelium from ectoderm, and we can also get epithelium from endoderm. Now pituitary gland says that I am developing from posterior pituitary. It actually says that I have arisen from the neuroectoderm. You remember that during the neurulation, neural tube formation, that there was this ectoderm, basically this flat ectoderm, right? And what actually happened, that this ectoderm, it folded, it rolled like this. You remember that? It rolled like this, and in this way the neural tube developed. We have a complete lecture on this topic as well. So in this way the neural tube developed. We have seen these things. So you remember that from the ectoderm this part called neuroectoderm developed, and from neuroectoderm ultimately diencephalon developed, and from diencephalon ultimately hypothalamus developed, and from hypothalamus posterior pituitary developed. So we can say that posterior pituitary develops from neuroectoderm. We can say posterior pituitary develops from neural part of ectoderm. So posterior pituitary is, in an essence, it is the ectodermal in origin, right? So posterior pituitary says that since I am ectodermal in origin, my friend which will come and sit beside me and which will be attached with me, that should also be ectodermal in origin. It should not be endodermal in origin. Well, actually, they are not talking in this way, but I am just telling you this story so that you can exactly remember that anterior pituitary also develops from the ectoderm. So, from where can we get the ectoderm? So, you see, with this blue one is ectoderm, and this ectoderm, which is just in front, just ventral and superior, ventral and cranial to the oropharyngeal membrane. Here, let me mark it for you, this specific ectoderm. This ectoderm is just below, it is just below the hypothalamus. It is very near to posterior pituitary. So this specific ectoderm can be used to form the anterior pituitary, right? So this ectoderm is basically, if you look carefully, this ectoderm, you see this hole, this was the depression called stomodium. So this ectoderm is basically the ectoderm of stomodium, or in textbooks you might have read that it is actually the oral ectoderm, because it is going to form the anterior part, especially of the oral cavity. So it is oral ectoderm, or it is the ectoderm of stomodium, or simply we can say that it is stomodium. So what we can say that this whole, this you can focus here, you can see this part is of course stomodium, right? So what we can say that the anterior pituitary, it develops from stomodium, or we can say anterior pituitary develops from oral ectoderm, or we can say that anterior pituitary develops from ectoderm. So please understand this thing. So from the stomodium another invagination develops, and this invagination or this outgrowth or this ingrowth, if we see from outside, this is ingrowth. So this invagination, ingrowth, or whatever you like to call it, basically it is invagination, right? So this invagination develops like this. So you see this invagination develops like this. Let's watch it again. So here you see this invagination develops, and this sac like invagination has been formed. Here you can see it is still from outside, it is opening right now, it is opening into the stomodium. It is opening into the stomodium. Now this invagination is called, it has got a very special name. It is called, this one is called Rathke's pouch. It is on the name of scientist who first described it. So it is called Rathke's pouch. You will have to remember this name because it is very important and often asked in exams. So this is Rathke's pouch. So what happens with this pouch or sac, that its distal end, it ultimately it is closed, and it loses its connection with the stomodium, right? It loses its connection with the stomodium, and now you can see it is separate from the stomodium. So you see, you understand this thing properly, that it is separate from the stomodium, and then it can go to the posterior pituitary and it will hug the posterior pituitary. Now here you can see that this Rathke's pouch, which has now formed, which has now been separated from the stomodium, it is now hugging the posterior pituitary, it is now hugging the pars nervosa. And now what it will do is that its cranial part, it will sort of circle this pituitary stalk. It will sort of encircle this pituitary stalk, and it will form a collar or tube around it. So it is incomplete collar or incomplete tube around it. You see? Let's watch the animation again. So you see, it is incompletely encircling the pituitary stalk. Now this part is actually called tuberellus part of tube-like part or tuberellus part. This part is actually called tuberellus part. All this is tuberellus part of pituitary gland, or simply pars tuberellus. So pars tuberellus develops from the cranial part of Rathke's pouch, and remaining part is going to form anterior pituitary, and sometimes here between the anterior and posterior pituitary, here a little bit part actually forms the intermediate part of pituitary gland. Somewhat here this little part, which is actually the posterior part of Rathke's pouch, this little part is actually called the intermediate lobe of pituitary gland, which is also called pars intermedia. It is more prominent in animals, but in humans it is not very prominent, so it is pars intermedia. This one is pars distalis, and this one is basically pars nervosa. This one is pars tuberellus. So I am labeling all these structures pars tuberellus, and here this now is pituitary stalk, which consists of this hypothalamic part, and outside it is the pars tuberellus part. So this is pituitary stalk, and above that this is infundibulum. This thickened part here, which is connecting with the stalk, it is the infundibulum. So these are all the structures of the pituitary gland. By the way, please don't forget, it is very important that here there will be somewhat here slightly ventral to infundibulum. Here there will be the crossing over of eye fibers, the visual fibers crossing over of optic nerve. This is the optic chiasma. So here there would be optic chiasma. Here I would also like to mention that pars distalis has another name. It is also called anterior pituitary, and it is also called adenohypophysis. Right, and pars nervosa, it is also called posterior pituitary, and it is also called the neurohypophysis. I think that is all about the development of the pituitary gland. Is very easy to understand. There is downward extension and upward extension, simple as that. Downward extension of hypothalamus forms posterior pituitary, upward extension of stomodium forms anterior pituitary. That is all about development of pituitary gland. And by the way, an important clinical correlate that as the Rathke's pouch is ascending upward and as it loses its connection, some part of Rathke's pouch may remain somewhat here in between along its root. Some part may remain anywhere along its root, and it may form a type of carcinoma which is called craniopharyngioma. So that is another important clinical correlate that I will not go into detail. So this was about the embryology or development of hypophyseal gland or pituitary gland. Thank you so much for watching this video. Have a great day. Goodbye.